presenter today is Derek Hatcher. Derek has worked in the digital space for over 10 years, analyzing customer data. He is passionate about the ever-changing digital world and enabling companies of all sizes to harness their data for good. Derek works in the solution consulting organizations, supporting and working with clients every day. Prior to Telium, he worked at several SaaS companies, along with working at some of the largest brands in the world, including Williams-Sonoma and Walmart. So sit back, relax, and enjoy today's webinar. Derek, let's get started.
Great. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, everyone, also for taking the time today. We're going to be discussing GDPR and how you can balance your customer experience along with privacy and security. I think it should be a great time for us to talk for about 20 or so minutes around this topic. So let's jump right in. Today, when we start talking about GDPR, what we really want to highlight is the history, some details around GDPR, but more importantly, the so what, and what does that really mean to you? Along with, how are you going to balance this in terms of a couple of key steps we have in terms of a scorecard that you can go through internally with your different teams to evaluate your readiness for GDPR, along with your overall point of view around data security and privacy with your customer information. Now, to that point, we've probably mentioned GDPR about 5 or 6 times. So some of you on the phone, this may be a brand new topic, and that's okay. So to define GDPR is the Global Data Protection Regulations. So this is a group of regulations that's really coming out as data becomes more and more relevant and companies start to appreciate the fact that their customer data is truly an asset and it needs to be protected. This regulation is coming out directly from the EU. So when does this regulation or GDPR take effect? At the time of this recording, a little over 200 days. Now, 200 days may seem like a big number. However, for most of you on the phone working at medium, large, or even small-sized companies, realize it takes time to put processes in place, adding new technology, and in some respects, actually adding people to your team to ensure GDPR compliance along with overall data strategy. So, who's actually affected by GDPR? The customer set really is EU citizens. This doesn't mean that you have to have a headquarters in the EU or even an office there. It simply means that somebody in your customer base happens to be an EU citizen. So you can see the scale in which GDPR will reach and have effect for companies across the globe. So how did we really get here? Back in 1995, when the Bulls were winning championships and I still had hair, things are a much different world when it came to the internet. You'll remember back then that we've had less than maybe 50 million internet users, and I'm going to be referring to some of the metrics on the right-hand column quite a bit throughout this presentation, so keep an eye on that. This is a little over 10 years before an iPhone came out, and about the same when Facebook was actually introduced. Now, of course, not everyone on the phone has an iPhone. However, most of us can say that they have smart devices as well as some sort of social impact. So we just want to highlight those as key benchmarks. So an EU put out a directive in 1995 around saying we do not want our citizens' data to be sent out of the EU. We want to protect that. A couple of years later, the UK decided, hey, we want to be able to get up to speed with the EU and we wanted to join into that same protection kind of agreement. So 3 years later, that happened, but you'll notice, and again, in our right-hand column with our metrics, that our internet users have actually almost tripled. We're still a little ways out from our phones or smart devices, as well as really the impact that social media had on everybody. But that goes alongside exactly the same type of growth that we see in general. So as data usage increases, the importance of data privacy also increases. We remember from some of the times when we had these huge mainframes in the 70s to going through the process of the mid 80s when PCs first came out to the 90s with Google, eBay, and then we started to see that now really increase in trajectory around data being collected across all these different channels. Again, going from your social, your devices, to the concept of big data, and then even moving into the Internet of Things, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the session. But again, the idea is that as technology grows, we have different ways of capturing data with the concept of increasing engagement, better retention, or just better data transfer to achieve certain business goals. So around 2000, this is when Safe Harbor was first established. And Safe Harbor really came to bear because US companies said, hey, listen, people are starting to use and engage with our brands via the internet, and we want to be able to safely and securely sell products, not just stateside, but over in the EU. So that's why it was designed with that policy in place to say, we want to be able to transact across the pond, so to speak. One key thing to remember about Safe Harbor was that it was based on self-certification. So we'll see how companies every year had to be self-certified and how that really has changed over time. So before we go too much further, I want to introduce you to this gentleman. Some of you may think that he's a European football player, and although he may enjoy some aspects of that game, his name is actually Max Schrems. And Max is actually an Austrian attorney that really focuses on protection and civil rights. And what happened was, as Max was traveling across the pond, again, the Atlantic, from Europe to the States, what he realized was that companies, in particular Facebook, was actually tracking him and looking at things such as location updates, pokes, likes, all the type of information. And he had the epiphany of, wait a second, they are actually potentially breaking some of the laws that are in place. I want to know all the data that they actually have about me. So after months and months of litigation and lots of lawyer meetings, Facebook finally sent over a plethora of information that they actually had captured about Max over time, to the tune of over 1,000 pages of information. Now, again, this is 2011, and the concept was, well, listen, Facebook's only really been at scale for a couple of years now. Imagine what's going to happen in 10 plus years from now. They're going to have information about everybody in their data set and being able to track all that information. I want to know exactly what the data they have about me, and I have access to that. That was very important. However, when Ed Snowden came to the scene, and through his process of working with folks like WikiLeaks and actually giving some information away around the prison project, around how the government was listening and tracking US citizens, it really opened the door for, hey, what are all these other brands capturing about us? What else do they know? And that became really Main Street, and for the first time exposed the fact that all this data and privacy is really a key aspect. And understanding exactly why that data is being captured, how it's being captured, and what is that data being used for, started to become the forefront. Again, this is back in 2013, so several years back. But the byproduct of that was Safe Harbor was basically invalidated. People weren't able to easily access that data when requested. Governments weren't able to easily access that type of information. And along with that, we had this exponential growth. So now those internet users went from less than 1 billion to over 3 billion, and over almost 1 billion phones were sold, and a little over 1 billion Facebook users were now active. So the growth of data that's being captured, along with the adoption of this, has just exceeded to continue to grow and grow and grow. And that's not going to change. At the top of the conversation, I had mentioned a little bit around the different types of devices moving from the mainframes to some of the social networks to devices, but also just the Internet of Things. As many of you must know today, you probably have things like watches that are smart, potentially tracking your sleeping behavior. Some of us now have lights that turn on and off, cars that start. There's basically all of these devices out there that are now making our lives easier in little snippets. However, they're also starting to collect very rich data that's very, very personalized about things like health. When you leave the house, when you come back to the house, all those types of things are now being collected by all these different devices. And if you guys haven't seen, that's not going to change. with the growth of different things such as AI, all these different types of devices and learning systems are going to be used to try and get smarter and to make our lives easier at the end of the day. But that all starts with data collection. So it becomes paramount around how companies are going to be able to deal with your privacy options and concerns and how they're actually collecting that data. So in 2006, GDPR was actually adopted. And again, the idea is that all these lawmakers are seeing these exact same trends. And they want to be able to put a process in place to ensure you give folks the ability to offer consent in terms of what is being tracked or not tracked about them. The guards, of course, are the main thing here is to guard and protect that personal data. The second big point that I just kind of highlighted is making sure everything is clear and transparent. The third is really a big one, and that's around data portability and the right to be forgotten. Meaning if a company or a person goes to a company and says, I would like for you to forget all of my information, they have to give you that option and they have to be able to act on it. That can become very challenging for a number of companies that today have disparate data systems, which for a lot of folks, hopefully on this webinar, are probably agreeing with me. One other cool thing that's happening with GDPR is that we're seeing the growth of what's called the data protection officer. This person has usually had some sort of experience around data privacy, understanding systems that are in place, probably have some sort of experience working with lawyers and understanding rules and regulations. But this office I see is becoming more and more paramount for all these different businesses. As we think about some of the recent breaches that have happened to things like Equifax, that becomes more and more important as people begin to hear about the fact that all this data is being collected and potentially being accessed and hacked. They want to know that companies that they work with, also that they invest with, have these types of people and processes in place to ensure all that data is protected. In addition to that, GDPR is encouraging pseudonymism as well as encryption, meaning we don't want data to flow easily from one point to another. There needs to be some level of encryption that doesn't make it easy for anybody to understand what that data element is. Again, we're not saying, and GDPR is not saying don't collect that data. They're just saying make it as secure as possible and do with it as you see fit. However, again, make it very difficult for anybody to potentially hack or have access to that information. So GDPR, talked a little bit about the history, a little about exactly what it is in detail. What are the implications? This is where the big boom comes into play. Basically with GDPR, they have said that they will potentially, for major infringements, fine companies 20 million euro or 4 million of annual take worldwide. That's a big number. Also, this is not a one-time and a double jeopardy situation. This is every time this happens, like a parking ticket, you can get an additional fine for every infringement. It will be really important for companies as they move towards this date, again, a little over 200 days from now, to prove that they've got some sort of processes in place to understand how they're handling that data. I don't foresee them coming down on that date and trying to crush everybody in terms of the legislative bodies, but I do see them starting to investigate what have you done to ensure that this kind of compliance is going to happen at your company. So really, really important stuff. So hopefully not everyone's too scared on the phone, but this is relevant and very, very timely. To take a step back, a little over 80% of people that were surveyed recently actually said that we aren't really doing anything or don't really know what GDPR is. So there's a lot of people out there still learning what it actually is, let alone taking the steps to go ahead and be compliant for GDPR. So there's still a lot of us working towards that. At the top, I talked about the so what. Here it is. While GDPR is really just European regulation that affects customers that have business in the EU, it's basically a precursor. Companies and countries and other entities are already talking about what they want to do to get to that next step or that next evolution of GDPR. So that's going to be different countries around the world. So there's going to be not just, hey, I want to be ready for GDPR, but you need to have a structure and processes in place that when GDPR does come to fruition, not only are you compliant with that, but when other people start to bolt on their version of it, which I'm sure will happen, that you're flexible enough to meet those demands. As we talked about a little bit earlier around the Equifax hack, people are becoming more and more concerned about their online privacy. You can see here some significant stats that people are more concerned about their privacy, let alone people worrying about their specific income, which in the past had been such a sensitive issue. But that's really become a topic for everybody. So what are some of those key things that you're going to do to make sure that you're ready for GDPR? First things first, making sure there's consent and transparency. Below are a couple of examples that you can see around folks like healthcare.gov, who have gone through the process of setting up a privacy manager that actually categorizes the different types of partners that they're working with, as well as an example of Volvo and their consent that they actually have based on geographical region. That's going to pop up and allow people to pick and choose exactly how they want to be tracked. So making sure this is at least part of your program is one of the first steps that has to happen. So some of the key things, I think, in terms of takeaways, GDPR is happening and is one of the biggest changes in data privacy in decades. Again, while it's an EU regulation, it really affects anybody who has customers in the EU. And basically, it's going to be a precursor for things down the road. There's obviously been a lot of these examples now happening in the States with things like super cookies, with companies actually sharing data without necessarily being transparent about it in the past. But in my mind, GDPR should really be viewed as an opportunity. For a lot of organizations that we meet with and discuss GDPR, sometimes for the first time, sometimes not, it's really interesting to see how organizations have traditionally been set up, where you may have IT professionals who are concerned about website operations, merchandisers who are interested in how they sell their products, lead generation people and understanding how they gather leads. Then you have your lawyers who in the past you've only talked to once or twice a year, now all coming to the table and talking about how are we going to consolidate all of this information that we have about our visitors so that we have a clear line to understanding exactly who that visitor is, so that if they come to us and say, I want you to forget all of my data, we actually have the ability to do that. That's a really interesting place to be. And I believe it's going to be an opportunity, because as you start to bring all these different groups together, what you're really doing is consolidating all of your data. The benefit of that can be you now having a cleaner, more relevant communication back to all of your customers. So I really do think that this is a huge opportunity. Going back to really level setting, again, in the survey that was done a little late last year, 97% of companies say they have no GDPR plan in place. So again, if you don't have a plan in place, it's not too late, but it is definitely time. That's going to be changing in the not too distant future. Again, from my perspective, and why I'm saying this one more time, this is really your opportunity as a marketer, a technical person, a legal person, executives, to really get people to the table. Not just because they have time on their calendars or they want to join. This is something that you have to come through as an organization and begin to build a plan around how you're going to use this data. This is going to solve a lot of foundational issues that in the past have existed in terms of data silos, processes in place, things of that nature. You finally have the time to bring all that opportunity together. So what can you do today? What I'm going to go through real quick is a data governance checklist. And on the website, we'll highlight it again. There's a whole section around GDPR compliance. This webinar will be there along with some other webinars and other educational videos around it. So there's a 5-step process that we found to be very successful, and I'll walk through that now. First things first, doing your due diligence. I can't say how frequently that we go and meet with partners and potential prospects, and I ask them about somebody who they're on their website that they're using as a vendor or a partner, and they say, well, we haven't actually used them in 2 years or 3 years, whatever it happens to be. So this is your chance to go through and look at all the different vendors from a technology perspective that you're actually working with today. Are they on your website? Should they be collecting your data? And also working with your internal teams on the business side to say, hey, where are we with our contracts? What is our exposure here as we're working with these different vendors? The second step is really starting to take data inventory. And what I really like and what we've seen be beneficial is that you'll notice this whole process has a business side, or the kind of people side, and then a technology side. When we start talking about data inventory, really comes into play where what do we need to deem as key data that we actually have to collect about our customers? So not just, hey, let's collect everything, but what do we need to know to operate our business as efficiently as possible? And then going through, where's that information captured? Is there financial information? Is there legal information, healthcare information, educational information? All these types of data that exist today, really, where is it? Why are we collecting it? And what are we trying to do with it? That becomes really, really important and a huge benefit, again, in terms of the opportunity that it comes to play with GDPR. The next step is really putting controls in place. So you go through, see exactly what you have, start taking inventory around that. Then you go through, okay, well, how are we going to build control around this? And this is really just developing these procedures, which sometimes takes the most amount of time. Again, because you're going to be working with so many different groups within your organization to finally come together to talk about, who has clarity into all these different things. How do we update our internal and external communications? Creating audit guidelines and testing. Again, GDPR is coming down the road, but it's really going to be about how you can stay compliant as well as being flexible with what might be coming next. All those kind of things are going to be very, very important. The next really big thing, and I think it goes back to the point we talked about a little earlier, is that data protection officer is creating a data governance panel. Again, this is going to be almost a matrix or usually cross interdepartmental groups where you may have, again, IT professionals, you may have your data analytics people, your marketers, some executives, some legal representatives, all coming to the table. And the team needs to understand all the ramifications of what they're doing. The day of the marketer looking for a low-cost provider to be able to grab leads in a rogue fashion is no more. Teams need to know exactly who they're working with, what those companies are actually doing with their data, and how that really complies and rolls into the overall corporate strategy. This is going to become important not only with your internal teams, but again, with your external partners as well, because the burden of proof, again, is on your organization, not your third-party vendors in terms of the access and what they're doing with that data. You're going to be the ones that are responsible for understanding what they are doing with that customer's data. And last is really provide clear and accurate notice. Again, this goes back to that consent and transparency. Making sure that you have an updated privacy policy, I should say, to reflect all that data usage information. Making sure that there's opt-in and opt-out across your different marketing channels. This is making sure that explicit opt-in and opt-out is available, ensuring the right to be forgotten and general deletion directives are in place. Again, all of these types of things, and I think that's one of the crux of the issue is to make that one bullet point valid, you have to go through all those other steps of understanding really where is your data, who has access to that data, how can we deal with all that information, and then being able to take action on it. So that's the last step that we wanted to talk about today. Hopefully this has been beneficial and a quick bite-sized chunk into what GDPR is, kind of the history of it, what you can do about it, and really the opportunity that it offers many, many teams. And that is the ability to really get the house in order, get all of your data in order, start working with different teams that you may not have worked with before, and really excelling as a company and going into the next generation of data privacy and data protection from a data perspective. For additional information, you can go to the TLM website, but I'll pass it over to Julie now to close down the webinar.
Thank you, Derek, and thank you so much to everyone else for joining us today. We appreciate your time and hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.